very good afternoon to one and all of you. It's been a couple of decades since we've been doing refractive surgery, and I think refractive surgery in general for all of us has been a huge journey, and definitely there have been upheavals, but there has been an escalation of our understanding of the whole process. And the most important thing is it has been as if we are trying to reach the zenith or beat the best as far as giving the very best to our patients. So of course, we were always abetted by having a newer diagnostics and advanced laser systems coming in at different punctuations. But what continued to remain is the art of refraction, which I still believe that in spite of all these diagnostics is the basic backbone in getting the best of results. So then, if you talk of art of refractive surgery, we need to keep in mind that the art of refraction has to be excellent, which means measuring to the least refractive error with cross cylinders, using the least minus prescription, doing cycloplegic refraction for a high probe, and keeping in mind the presbyopia concern. And when we talk of the art of refraction, that itself gives us a clue of a scissoring reflex and is a ploy in itself. But then we've moved forward, and today we talk of topographics and huge range of tomographic clues. When you look at this patient, a very regular pentacam map, a very small refractive error, we know the Bellin is optimal, but then as you've understood in the due course of talks, that we now believe that Corvus has to be kept in mind, may not be the decision taker, but it definitely is a step forward in our understanding. We've gone further now. We talk about segmental tomography, where we talk of epithelium and the different layers of cornea which we can measure. We talk of epithelial mapping, which has a definite role in decision taking, especially when you're stuck with regressions and overcorrection. We know that the high frequency ultrasound gives us again a whole lot of information, but needs a coupling fluid. And again, the anterior segment OCT stands absolutely with great accuracy. Of course, it's a non-contact method. So essentially, when you talk of epithelial map, besides all that Dr. Praveen said, the mystery of regressions and overcorrections are better understood, because we know that epithelium just grows in and covers all the defects like a carpet over a problems. But more importantly, we now understand why we are stuck when we use smaller optic zones or do a hyperopic correction, because the amount of epithelial hyperplasia is related to the amount of curvature change which is induced, and that defines how thick the epithelium would be, and then accordingly you can plan how you would treat these patients. We also understand now about Q factor and surface regularization of the eye, which would enhance the quality of vision. And taking you through different examples of doing a topo-guided PRK or a contour vision, as you'd call. This is again a decent 489 corneal thickness, a simple refractive error. We could have just done a wavefront optimized treatment, and the ablation needed was only 36 micron. But then there are these comas and trefoils which you see, and if you could just do a 6 micron of ablation, you are able to justify a greater quality of treatment to these patients. And now there's a whole lot of clamor about doing contour vision. Then again, we do topo-guided PRK. This was a very regular cornea, but ended up with a free flap, and the limbus to limbus approximate orientation of the flap was not optimal, and this was how the topography became. And then you look at the Zernike's polynomials, and then you realize that this would probably do ideally by doing a regularization of this eye, and as the cornea was thin, just a small 0.75 correction with the nomogram was done, and the topography improved. And then after a period, once the refraction and the topography regularized, a wavefront optimized treatment was done, and the patient ended up with a plano 6.6. Then we realized that if you understand the higher order aberrations better, you're doing a better job with the normal corneas and again with the abnormal corneas. In this interim, there was a lot of information about how we were going wrong in some of those cases, which Dr. Ramurthy told, how little we knew before, and then there was an explosion of information by the proponents that all these risk factors have to be looked into, and ectasia risk scoring system has to be given importance, look for those skewing and those topographic abnormalities. And then around 2014, there was a greater understanding about the percentage of tissue altered and how, if it is more than 40%, yes, it is a very big signal. And it's, though there were different articles which came in, that was not the holy grail, that just because a PTA was more than 45%, it did not mean the patient would get ectasia in every single situation. But if you compare it to the other risk scoring systems, it did continue to be of greater prevalence. Again, literature review tells us that doesn't mean just because a mesopic pupil is 7 that you use a 7 millimeter optic zone. Keeping a 6 millimeter or 6.5 would do for these patients, but not transgressing to 5.5. Then we came to realize that these active eye trackers and cyclotorsion compensations were definitely the way forward. But at this time, again, there was also this understanding that this angle kappa had to be kept in mind. So then, do we center on the corneal vertex? Do we center on the visual axis? Or do you decenter it to position it somewhere between the two? And that's where these offset treatment algorithms became popular. We also needed to keep in mind that there was this component called lenticular astigmatism, or where are we as far as this is concerned? Like if you can look at the refractive error was -3 cylinder, but the corneal cylinder was just about 1.2. And then when the Belen, of course, was normal, and then we look at the eye trace, the tracy refraction tells us the amount of astigmatism is nearly 4.25. Then, what does it mean? What do we treat? I really do not have an answer. Would I go ahead and do a clear lens extraction in this young patient? Yes, I wouldn't. So then, how do I treat it? Then came the other area of gray area was, do we do a correction on a topography in an ectatic cornea based on the manifest refraction, or do we do an aberrometry refraction? Now I'm going to show you two examples here then. This is the atypical ectatic cornea. You can see it's a centered cone, and then the usual way of looking at the target Q and seeing that the mean deviation is within normal limits. So if you are not doing any refractive correction, this is how it's going to be your myopic and your peripheral hyperopic correction. So then you have a choice of going by the clinical refraction with an axis of 90 to treat, or going by the aberrometric refraction of 48 to treat. But if you look at the maps, when you stuck to your aberrometric refraction too, the cornea definitely did better. It was a more symmetric, a more aspheric cornea which you could provide to this ectatic eye. But then it was not an answer in all situations. Again, a usual kind of an ectatic cornea, as you can see here, and then taking you forward. Now again, do I go by the clinical refraction or do the 17-degree axis? So this is how it looks if I go by the clinical refraction. And this seems to make more sense if you look. It has a flattening here and that peripheral steepening which is caused by the hyperopic ablation. So it makes sense to do that. Whereas if we were to go by the topographic axis, I'm sorry, taking you to the next slide. If I were to go by the aberrometric refraction, this is how it would be. It does not seem to justify at all. So then you need to try each situation and then titrate which is going to be the ideal for your final answer. And this is how symmetric the cornea became in this ectatic eye with a significant gain of 6/6 vision from a 6/24 vision. So then there was a lot of understanding of biomechanics, which we have heard a lot about today, and it has definitely made us realize that sclera sans topmost, followed by Bowman's, and followed by all these layers in the sequential order. We all know that the lamellae is tightly packed in the anterior cornea and more loosely packed in the mid and the posterior cornea. And the Brilliant microscopy studies exactly correlate with what we have understood with the other mechanisms. So we also then see that SMILE is only making an incision centrally and not invading the peripheral cornea. So does that mean that SMILE is biomechanically more stable? Yes, there is a strength of the cap and that area below the lenticule which is removed as against LASIK and PRK. There have been different articles which have tried to compare SMILE with LASIK and LASIK, but what comes to a final understanding is they are nearly comparable. Maybe SMILE is better in some of these eyes. Aura has not taken us anywhere. Probably extremely abnormal eyes we are better clued that we do not touch these eyes, but probably towards that, I'm not going to go on into the corpus, which was so extensively discussed, but yes, there is the advantage here that it combines the biomechanical indices with a whole range of deformation amplitude and different signals which it tells us, and it combines it with the pentacam, and based on that, there is a better summation of information, and this results tells us that the TBI index fares better than the BAD and the CBI. Now, if you look, everything is in the green, and it's a normal tomographic, normal eye. Whereas here, you can see the TBI is in the red, and so is it in the CBI and the BAD. It's an obvious form for osteokeratoconus. But then, look at this case. This is a normal thickness cornea, nearly normal looking parameters. The BAD is again fairly all right, and the TBI alone is in the red. So I thought that this is again another biomechanical index which is definitely going to create more confusion. But when you look into the left eye, there is an obvious ectasia. So it tells us that we need to keep all these newer devices which have come up, and maybe with a pinch of salt, and use our clinical sense which has accumulated over the period of time. Brilliant microscopy tells us there is a definite weakening or lesser viscosity in the center as against the periphery, and this tells us that if it is so, if the periphery is going to be nearly normal, then why not we do a customized focal treatment for keratoconus instead of doing a full-blown treatment over the entire cornea. Then again, CXL with laser vision correction, do we just sit tight on those suspicious topographies, knock them off? What do we do when those regressions we want to enhance? What do we do about borderline corneal thickness? And then this is a case of 487 with, I'm sure Dr. Praveen would consider doing a PRK in his eye because PRK is quite a favorite. But does it not make sense in these kind of situations to combine it with cross-linking? Again, to end up with a more safer, at least a psychological support to us, because there are still greater clarity to be understood. We now understand better about certain procedural refinements, as you can see, that like how you could ensure when you're doing a SMILE that you dock it, do not have any, it's an auto-centering device which you have here, it's not moving. So auto-centration is there, there's no eye trackers, but yet if you see it has that infrared guide which tells us whether we are centered, and if you dock optimally, if you see that you do not have a dense OBL, then the surgery is just a cakewalk, and definitely the visual acuity is awesome in these patients on the very second post-op day if you have optimized your parameters against what you were alluded to by my earlier speaker. Of course, we need to optimize our energy settings. We need to know how to titrate and play around with it. You need to understand the technology in toto before we push aside one technology and just raise the other one. I think each of them have promises to offer, and each are doing fairly well. We need to go and look into the dissection approaches. When you're talking about doing a SMILE procedure, we need to define that area. There's probably some more surgery when you're doing SMILE. You need to go in and separate these tissue bridges most optimally, define the lower dissection plane, and believe me, in one and all of these cases, once you have learned the art, the lenticule just comes out in no time. I mean, I don't know whether to wait and show because of the paucity of time, but you can see the lenticule is beautifully separating out. You need to, we don't even spend as much time now because we just know how to go in and separate, and out comes the lenticule and the surgery is done. And last but not the least, there is definitely a wider understanding we have today for the enhancement options. Do we do a PRK? Do we do a flap lift? Do we know we won't do a flap lift after 3 years because of the terror of epithelial ingrowth? Do you do LASIK on a flap if your flap is thick? Do we do LASIK on your cap if your cap is thick? But then, I think we need to consider the epithelial maps here. It's a small, simple refractive error, and if you look at the topography is, and the symmetry and the centration, everything has been perfectly all right. The patient has a 0.25 with 0.75 SIL. So definitely, we need to realize that there has been a little more of an epithelial modeling or a epithelial hyperplasia which has occurred in this eye. So why do I do a PRK in this eye as an enhancement? I would do a flap lift for this patient because it's still within the 3-year period. So whereas if there is not been that kind of an epithelial hyperplasia, and if it is later on, yes, we could consider doing a PRK for these eyes. So then, where are we as far as this art of refractive surgery is concerned? I would still say that we are in the process of understanding, and one needs to be always running to stand where you do. Thank you.